What's up everyone, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions. In today's video I'm going to take some time to go over developing swim-specific strength. Alright, so let's dive right in. So when we think about swim-specific strength, there's a little bit of a difference between strength in the water versus strength on dry land. And so I'm going to be using the term dry land throughout this presentation. And so anytime I refer to dry land, it's essentially just anything that takes place out of water. It's really common, especially for those who swam growing up. Swimming coaches would refer to anything that's done outside of the water as dry land exercises or dry land work. So that's kind of what that term is referring to. But strength in the water is a little bit different than strength on dry land. So obviously the stronger someone is, the stronger an athlete is on dry land, the more strength they're going to have in the water, right? But not necessarily all of that strength carries over specifically to being used in the water, right? So if I just did a bunch of bench press and I got a really strong upper body, that strength that I developed by doing bench press doesn't 100% carry over to the water in the same way that, say, doing certain things in the water like paddle work, which I'm going to get into in a second, is going to carry over towards your swim stroke much more specifically. So a couple different ways that you can develop strength in the water. One of those ways is through different dry land methods. And so I'm actually going to start by talking about some of those methods first. And then the other way of developing strength in the water is through in-water methods. And there's a few different ways that I'm going to touch on with in-water methods as well. So moving on to some dry land methods. So obviously, strength training with free weights, machines, cables, anything that just develops basic muscular strength and endurance is going to make you a better athlete in general, right? So there's a stronger athlete and an athlete with more resiliency and endurance in their muscles is just going to be a better athlete in general, right? And so some of that strength and resiliency and endurance that you build in your musculature through doing free weight exercises, machine exercises, cable exercises translates over into the water just because you have more strength in general, right? And so in order to develop basic strength, you can do things with free weights, machines, and cables. And if you're a beginner, obviously you're going to start out by learning just foundational movement patterns and doing things such as squatting and lunging and doing various presses and pulling exercises. And traditionally, if you work with some kind of strength and conditioning professional or a coach, they'll probably have you start out with, like I said, really basic movement patterns, higher repetitions and lighter weights, just so that you can build a foundation of some basic strength and endurance. And that's going to be, you know, somewhere in the realm of like 2 to 3 sets of 12 to 15 reps. And then eventually, as you move on, you'll progress to heavier resistance training with lower repetitions and heavier weights. And this is where a lot of the benefits of strength training comes in for endurance athletes, is with the lower repetition and heavier weight stuff, because that builds a lot of muscular strength, not only in the muscles themselves, but in the nervous system. So strength is a product of the force that you can recruit with your muscles, right? And so a lot of things contribute to that. Some of it is just raw muscular strength, and another piece of it is the neuromuscular system. So getting down and doing low repetition, heavy weight type exercises really challenges not only the musculature system, but also the neuromuscular system, and you build a lot of strength that way. And that's where you really build strength that can translate over into some of the things that you're doing in the water with your swim stroke. But like I said, those strength gains translate over to swimming only to a point. And this is mainly because the type of resistance that you're overcoming on dry land, which is essentially gravity, right? All the weight is trying to be pulled down towards the ground, and your job is to move it away from the ground, and that's how you're providing resistance to the body. But with swimming, the forces that you overcome are obviously a little bit different, and they're placed upon the body in a slightly different manner because you're in a body of water, right? You're not out in dry land where gravity pulling you down is your primary form of resistance. So the strength gains that you make with dry land strength training carries over, but like I said, only to a point. So ways that you can get a little bit more specific with developing strength in the water. One of the first ways you can do it is with swim cords or stretch cords. And you can see over here, this is Gwen Jorgensen, pretty well-known female triathlete, won Olympic gold in 2016 Rio Olympics. She's over here using some resistance cords to do some swimming-like motions with her arms. So she's obviously doing this as part of like a warm-up before she gets in the water for a race. But doing things with cords or resistance bands outside of the water can be a great way of now providing resistance to your muscles, but in a very swim-specific movement, right? So let's use the example of a lat pull down or a pull-up, right? Most people know what a pull-up is. So with a pull-up, you're obviously building strength in your big upper back muscles, your latissimus dorsi muscles, which are important for building strength in the muscles that you're using during a swimming motion, right? So when we're doing a freestyle motion, we're using those big upper back muscles primarily as our way of moving our arms through the water and helping propel us forward through the water. But if I do a pull-up versus this swim-specific motion with resistance cords, which one do you think is going to be more specific to the swim motion? Obviously doing it with the swim cords. So we can do pull-ups to build just basic strength, or lat pull-downs if you can't do a pull-up, or other types of rowing motions. You can do those exercises to build a basic foundation of strength in those muscles, but doing it in a swim-specific motion and providing resistance in a swim-specific motion with resistance bands or swim-specific bands is just going to be that much more specific, and you're going to be developing strength in the specific motion that you want to develop strength in. And so down here I've kind of highlighted this term specificity, which specificity is really important when you're doing anything from a strength and conditioning standpoint or an athletic standpoint, because the more specific you can make the movement and the more specific you can make the application of force during the exercise as to what the athlete is actually going to be trying to overcome in real life, the more those gains or the more those improvements are going to translate over specifically to the type of activity you want them to. So in this example, building strength with any kind of pulling motion is great, but if we can make it more specific by doing a swim-like motion, like Gwen Jorgensen's doing over here with resistance bands, that strength and endurance that we develop is just going to carry over that much better when we actually go to swim in the water, because we're building the strength in this freestyle motion that we're going to be then doing in the water. So with these stretch cords or swim cords, you can buy these from a ton of different retailers. Amazon's normally where I go to for some of these kind of things, but there's a specific brand called Stretch Cords that you can buy that have paddles on them, and I'll actually link those, a link to a website that sells these in the description below this video so that you can click on them and order them if you don't have them. But they make bands specifically that have paddles on the end of them, so it's almost like you're doing or using paddles in the water, and it just helps you replicate that swim motion a little bit easier. But essentially Gwen Jorgensen is doing it without the paddles on the end. She just has little round tubular handles. But you can use these bands like she is as a warm-up before a swim session. This is great, especially if you're not able to get in the water before a race. It's a really great way of warming up the muscles in your upper body through the swim-specific motion. You can use them as part of a cool down after a swim session when your muscles are fatigued, and you can just develop even more endurance in those muscles after they're already fatigued from swimming. But you can also do this as something outside of swim sessions where you build strength by doing sets of high repetitions of a freestyle motion with the cords, and over time this will just help develop even more endurance and a basic foundation of strength in your freestyle motion and in those upper body muscles that are involved in the freestyle swim stroke. And then another way that we can develop strength in our swim stroke now is moving to in-water methods. So paddle work in the water is probably one of the simplest ways of developing strength in your swim stroke in the water. Really doing anything in which you're taking the lower body out of the equation is a great way of building strength in your swim stroke, more specifically in your upper body, because you're just placing more load on the arms. So using a pull buoy and then throwing paddles on is a great way of just taking the legs out of the equation and then placing all of the work onto the upper body. And essentially think of paddle work as resistance training in the water, right? Because as you have the paddle over your hand, you're creating a greater surface area for water to run into, and so you are basically trying to overcome more water that you're trying to push behind you with the paddles, and that just creates greater resistance, right? And therefore you have to overcome it with more force generated by the upper body muscles. So these are great to add into like long aerobic swim sets so that you're getting not only the aerobic work of the swim set, but you're also getting the added strength benefit from throwing on the paddles. So this is something that you can easily work into your swim routine once or maybe twice a week. Be cautious in the beginning if you're new to using paddles, because since it does place more stress on the upper body and on the arms, it can add a little bit more tension and torque to the shoulder joint. And so if you're not used to it and then all of a sudden you're doing like every single swim session with paddles, it could make the shoulders a little bit more sore than usual. And if you're not careful over time, you could develop some injuries in the shoulder joint if you overuse the paddles. So my recommendation would be to, if you're new to them, use them maybe once a week or once every other week just to introduce them into your swim routine. And then once you've introduced them into your swim routine, you can probably use them pretty comfortably once or twice a week for bits and pieces of swim sets. But I like to work them into aerobic swim sets just because it's not the easiest to work them into swim sets where the goal is to try and go really, really fast or really, really hard during like interval or tempo efforts. And it doesn't necessarily work out incredibly well for super, super easy swim sets where the goal is to go very, very easy because it just provides more resistance. So you tend to work a little bit harder to move yourself through the water. So I like to personally build them in with aerobic swim sets. It just kind of makes the most sense to me that way. And then other methods that we can use to improve strength in the water. So there's a couple more in-water methods that you can use that some recent research has suggested translates over to the swim-specific movement pretty well. So a couple of those is using resistance bands and parachutes in the water. So essentially this is kind of similar to using paddles in the water in the sense that you're providing resistance in the water while you're doing the freestyle motion. So you can obviously see here this person has a parachute behind them catching water as they swim along, and so that's obviously providing more resistance, and therefore to move forward in the water you're going to have to provide more force with your upper body to propel yourself forward. Same thing with the resistance bands, just kind of another way of doing what the parachute is doing essentially. But there's some research to show that these types of exercises improves swim-specific strength directly, right? Kind of like paddle work would in the water as well. And then another method that you can use that's a dry land method actually, and a method that some research suggests translates over into swimming pretty well, is using inertia-based training. And so this one's going to be a little bit less common for swimmers and triathletes to use because you have to have pretty specialized equipment, and that equipment can be pretty pricey. But essentially inertia-based training is doing movements like this woman is right here, doing movements where the resistance is provided by a flywheel instead of gravity. So the flywheel right here is providing resistance as she moves up and down in the squat motion, as opposed to her just doing a squat without this machine and gravity is the sole form of resistance. And it could just be that type of resistance translates over to the water because it's more similar to the type of force that you have to overcome in swimming. And obviously if you were trying to do this type of training to improve your upper body pull strength, you would have to do flywheel or inertia-based training for the upper body, not necessarily a squat like she's doing here. But there is some research to suggest that type of exercise does translate over to the swim a little bit better than traditional free weight or machine or cable-based movement patterns. And so, like I said, the only downside to these methods here, the resistance band method, the parachute method, and then the inertia-based training method, is just the cost and availability of equipment. This is kind of less common to see these types of things used. Maybe with like elite athletes or collegiate athletes where they have access to specialized equipment or the different types of resistance band setups and parachutes. But for the most part, paddle work and just basic body weight, free weight, machine and cable based exercises are going to be the most common. And then the other way of doing it is having resistance bands and doing the freestyle motion with the added resistance provided by the bands. Those are relatively inexpensive. All right, so in conclusion, just to summarize things a little bit, swim-specific strength is different than dry land strength, and this is because the strength that you develop on dry land, you simply have to learn over time how to take that strength and apply it to the water in the swim-specific motion. And so the strength that you build on dry land isn't guaranteed to automatically translate over to the water. It takes time to to get the body to neuromuscularly learn how to like take that strength and apply it to the swim stroke. So different ways you can develop swim-specific strength, just a recap from what we covered. So first, there's dry land resistance training. And again, this is anything with body weight, free weights, machines, and cables. And this is a great way of just developing better general muscular strength and endurance. But again, you have to learn over time how to take that strength that you have and translate it to the swim-specific motion that you're doing. Now, ways that you can get a little bit more specific. Swim cords or stretch cords is a great way of adding extra resistance to the swim motion on dry land. So doing sets and repetitions of the swim cords or the stretch cords just adds that extra resistance to the swim stroke, and over time you're going to build that strength and endurance in the swim specific motion, right? So it's just getting a little bit more specific, and now getting even more specific, taking paddles and using those in the water. That's a great way of adding extra resistance to the swim stroke while you're in the water. So again, getting even more specific now. And then other methods that we covered, in-water resistance methods through bands or parachutes. This is a little bit less common just because they tend to be a little bit more pricey in cost and a little bit harder to come by. But again, great ways of adding resistance to the swim stroke itself while you're in the water. And then inertia-based training. This is probably the least common method of developing swim-specific strength that you'll see, probably used more by professionals or collegiate athletes that have access to this specialized type of equipment. But again, still another way that some research suggests developing strength that'll carry over specifically to the swim-specific motion. So hopefully you found this useful in terms of developing swim-specific strength. If you have any questions on any of this stuff, you can feel free to leave a comment below, or you can shoot me an email at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. Take care and good luck implementing this stuff into your training.